This video was brought to you by Squarespace.
Oh, it's moldy!
Metroid is amazing. I know, controversial opinion. My hot take today is that there have been many great games in the Metroid series, IMHO. But there's one thing about the series that feels slightly annoying. Apart from wall jumping in Super Metroid. Why is it so hard? Also that thing when you know there's like one exact something you need to find and do in the whole world and you have no idea where it is and you spend hours just wandering around. Also the Spider Guardian. Okay, there are a few annoying things in Metroid games, but one annoyance that feels particularly silly is Samus's embarrassing habit of losing most of her abilities at the beginning of her adventures. For example, Metroid Prime. She starts with missiles and morph ball and whatnot, then bam, big explosion, and oh no, she's lost all her abilities. Straight into Metroid Prime 2. She's going for a stroll, feeling fine, when bam, the Ing come and eat up all her items, num num num. And oh no, she's lost all her abilities. I mean, you see it a lot in this series. Other M at least tries to be creative with it, explaining that Samus technically does start the game with all of her abilities, but she has to get permission to use each one from her commanding officer, which is, I mean, it's cool you tried something different, but that is awful. Anyway, there isn't always a definite moment of each game when Samus is effectively reset. Some games just kind of start with the basic tools. Sometimes her new suit will be conveniently downgraded at the end of a game. Sometimes you can just try to convince yourself that if Samus is leaving the planet filled with purple zappy doors, she doesn't need the purple zappy gun anymore, and she's probably just gonna throw it in the trash when she's done. We do our best to fill in the gaps. But ultimately, convenient headcanon will only get you so far, and Samus losing her stuff is a thing you'll have to see a lot if you pick up these games. And like, I get it. You know, I've never been one to complain about it too much because the reason this happens is obvious. It basically goes without saying. The Metroidvania genre is predicated on the idea of slowly gaining abilities in order to progress through the game world. That's the foundation that this kind of game is built upon. If Samus kept every item and upgrade from Prime 1 going into Prime 2, you'd have some problems on your hands. Now she's way too powerful right off the bat, and there's no steady and satisfying sense of progression. Now she's got a bunch of abilities that don't necessarily play into the mechanical themes of this new game, and adding even more abilities on top of the old ones would be way too complicated. You don't need me to explain it. You know why clumsy old Samus just can't stop tripping and falling and losing everything she's got like a horror movie protagonist who can't seem to hang on to a flashlight or anything resembling a weapon. Mechanically, it makes sense. But narratively, it is a bit silly. These games are very serious and cool, and they're trying to build a world and tell a consistent story, yet when you get to that part of a Metroid game's intro, you've just got to roll your eyes and let it play out. Let it do what it needs to do, I get it. And it's funny that this is pretty much only a problem with Metroid, because there are a lot of Metroidvanias out there, like a ton, but they don't seem to run into this issue. They don't insist that their characters have to lose their abilities at the beginning of each sequel. And why is that? Well, it's because Metroid is the only long-running Metroidvania series. I mean, obviously, Castlevania is a thing, that's where the Vania comes from, and that's been running just as long as Metroid. But this isn't as much of an issue for Castlevania because not every one of its games fits snugly into the Metroidvania genre, and the series stars many different characters across many centuries. This level of consistency just isn't as important. And elsewhere? Well, have you noticed that Metroidvanias don't tend to get a lot of sequels? I mean, it kinda makes sense. It's hard to believe now, but the genre has only become, like, a real genre in recent years. Shadow Complex came out in 2009, and when it did, it was like a big deal. No one could stop talking about how someone was making a game that was like Super Metroid, except it wasn't Super Metroid. It was a new game. Like, that was genuinely novel at the time. Even after that point, it took a while before new Metroidvanias were hitting the scene at a steady rate. So the genre has only really been a thing for like 15 years, and a big thing for maybe the latter half of that, which hasn't left a ton of time for long-running series. Most Metroidvanias are content being one-and-done experiences. Sequels do happen, but you usually get like one sequel, if that. Then consider that most Metroidvanias are indie games, and indie studios don't generally feel like pumping out endless sequels to one game. And if you're just doing one sequel, then this whole ability thing isn't nearly as much of a problem. If you can conveniently explain why the character loses their abilities just this once, or use a new character, or even just gloss over the whole issue entirely and hope no one notices, you're good. The problem only arises when you release many games across many decades. In that case, you gotta come up with something. You constantly face the problem. Is it better to offer a silly, nearly fourth wall breaking explanation for the lack of abilities at the start of a game, or to just ignore the whole thing? Which option is less likely to break immersion? And I can see both sides, really. There are pros and cons to each. It's worth noting, Metroid has this problem a lot. But can you imagine how much more of a problem it would be if the series had been releasing games at a consistent pace this whole time, like Castlevania? Maybe the long gaps between Metroid games has nothing to do with sales or series interests or funding. Maybe they just keep trying to dream up new reasons for Samus to lose everything and coming up blank. Dread only happened decades after the fact because one day, Yoshio Sakamoto was taking a bath and suddenly he sat bolt upright and shouted, "Physical amnesia!" And he grabbed a towel and ran to the office to get started. Anyway, this entire discussion has been dredged up again because of an interview between Game Reactor and Metroid Dread director Jose Luis Marquez. When asked if Samus really needs to lose her abilities at the start of every game, he said, "In the case of Metroids, yes, it has to be like that. You can't start the game without losing things. It's mandatory. Otherwise, I think you would be disappointed. It's like, what? You get everything from the beginning? It can't be." And yeah, he ain't wrong, as we've established, but it's gotten me thinking all over again. Does it need to be this way? I mean, it does, at least to some degree. But even if Samus needs to lose her abilities, does she need to lose all her abilities? Could more be done to balance the mechanical need for resets with the desire for narrative sense? Does Samus have to start from square one every single time? Or could there be a little more wiggle room here? Is it possible to come up with a solid set of abilities that Samus never has to lose, and to remain confident in allowing her to keep them, making it much easier for the player to hand-wave away the loss of other more game-specific abilities without explicitly mentioning or showing it happening? Well, this is something I'd love to explore. Do not continue until I remind you that this video was brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace makes building a website as easy as 1, 2, 3, even if you have literally zero experience with any of this stuff. Between the many templates to start with and the intuitive builder, you'll have a slick, professional-looking site in no time. Then managing and creating content is just as easy. My site is a blog, so I can format text and images and video and all that super simple. Schedule my posts to publish and push to social media automatically, then just sit back and let the thing run itself. If you need more for your site, Squarespace offers many powerful extensions, and built right in is a nice suite of analytics so you always know what content is doing best. To try out Squarespace for yourself, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, head to squarespace.com/Arlo to save 10% off your first website or domain. And now for today's recommendation, stevia powder. I've experimented with a lot of alternative sugars, including ones with stevia in them, but getting just pure stevia powder was a game changer. It's so potent that just a teensy little pinch does it, and it sweetens up my coffee without giving me the same tummy troubles I sometimes get from sugar alcohols. Thanks again to Squarespace. Now continue. When it comes to Samus's signature moves, really you're looking at a handful of tools. There's the arm cannon, which is pretty much mandatory. Even if you can't do anything else, you need to be able to shoot. But then you've got the charge beam, which allows her to charge up a more powerful shot, missiles, which are also powerful and even home in on enemies in the Prime games but require expendable ammo, and the morph ball, which allows her to turn into a ball, which is really weird when you actually stop to think about it, so we've all collectively decided to just not stop and think about it because it's really cool mechanically. To me, that's her primary toolkit. Those basic abilities make Samus Samus. Those are abilities that you can't really take away without giving a good explanation. And I'll admit, it would be hard not to drip feed these to the player because they offer such good progression opportunities. Doors or debris you can't get through until you've got the charge beam or missiles, holes you can't get into until you got the morph ball. I can see the temptation to remove these from Samus's arsenal. But have we maybe worked through these limitations enough times? Is it maybe time to let the player start with these and just design around it? Come up with new early game limitations? I mean, the Prime games have this whole system where different types of material are weak to different weapons. Even if you've got the morph ball, there could be something blocking the entrances to holes and pipes that you need a new weapon for. They could design any number of materials or objects that prevent you from using these basic abilities in every case, so you still get this sense of progression. I feel like having access to some morph ball holes but being blocked from lots of others early on is a perfectly happy medium. Now, I'll admit that while it's a little easier to lampshade the disappearance of many game-specific items, there are others that feel like narratively and logically they should be a consistent part of Samus's arsenal as well. Space boots, which give Samus the ability to double jump, or some sort of grapple, these are so useful and come up so much that there's really no reason why she wouldn't hang on to them forever. And the biggest one, morph ball bombs. This is also a classic Samus ability, so much so that I might be swayed into including them in the list of forever abilities that she never loses. I guess I could go either way. Morph ball and morph ball bombs naturally go hand in hand, but progression-wise, it's such a great ability to pick up after a while of just plain morph ball sans bombs. Whatever the case though, you could definitely argue that Samus losing morph ball bombs, double jump, and grapple at the beginning of each game is weird. But the point here is not to come up with a perfect solution, because a perfect solution to this particular problem simply doesn't exist. At least the way I see it, there's no way to give the player a perfect explanation for why Samus loses her abilities in every case without eliciting at least a few eye rolls, nor can you allow her to keep every ability that, realistically, it would make sense to keep. You can't have your cake and eat it too. That's why I'm opting for a happy medium. Because again, we don't need perfect explanations. We're willing to gloss over the whole thing to give a passing thumbs up to that convenient lampshade if they strike a good enough balance. Take away everything and say nothing, we wonder why that would happen. Give us a solid reason in a long line of more or less solid reasons, it feels a little silly. But let us start with just enough of Samus's classic abilities, and I think we might just roll with it without questioning. I mean, the question might tickle us in the back of the brain just a little when we look up at a ledge and wonder what happened to our space boots. But it still feels like a happy medium to me, with little to no eye rolling required. And heck, every game is different. I have no doubt that they could find a way to let the players have even the morph ball bombs, double jump, and grapple right at the start. For at least one game, it might act as a fun challenge to design around. They could even have one or two specific abilities taken offline at the start, or even partway through, just to throw a curveball at the player. Every game can play with these ideas. And of course, if they've made, 2 or 3 games where Samus starts with the basics, like I'm proposing, then I'd say they've earned the opportunity to fall back on the age-old classic of having her lose everything in some sort of convenient explosion without rolling too many eyes. I think variety is really what the series needs. When something happens every time, or almost every time, that's when it starts to feel silly. Play around with it, be a little flexible, and you might just avoid the issue. Of course, we do have to ask ourselves, does this matter enough to change at all? Is it worth playing with these mechanics, trying to strike a better narrative and mechanical balance? Or is this a classic Nintendo case of shut up and play the stupid game, it doesn't have to make sense? Because it is indeed true that it does not have to make sense. No, this doesn't actually matter. But hey, I like believing that it matters somewhat. So I have to at least entertain the idea that it might matter somewhat to someone at Nintendo or Mercury Steam. If someone, in theory, did care enough to try and fix this, what might they do? It is also worth noting that this isn't that much of a problem for a much more unfortunate reason. As we touched on earlier, these games don't get made very often. I mean, the output has been great this generation, with Samus Returns in 2017, Dread a couple years ago, and Prime 4 finally coming in 2025. But unless the Metroid pipeline gets fully and permanently unclogged and suddenly Nintendo is giving us a new one every few years, this will remain a non-issue. So while I do indeed understand that for the most part Samus needs to start each game with a clean slate, a fresh palette, I don't think I agree with the idea that Samus needs to lose everything in every case. And even if just to keep things fresh, I'd like to see them tinker with some new ideas in this department, rather than simply giving us another explosion, or crash, or evil bug attack, or abusive relationship with an overbearing military officer. Before we wrap this up, because I am addicted to giving opinions, I'd like to talk about two other things Mr. Marquez said in that interview. He mentioned that Metroidvanias are better when they're shorter and more compact. I would say that there is something really cool about exploring an enormous world for many, many hours. Blasphemous and Hollow Knight come to mind in particular. It's great falling in love with a game and feeling like the world just never ends. It just keeps going and going. A long runtime and an epic scope can definitely elevate the experience. But he's not wrong that Metroidvanias work really, really well when they're short. Dread isn't the shortest game around, but it ain't the longest either. And at first, I was slightly disappointed by how quickly I could beat it, but now I only see it as a strength. The game is so much more fun to sit down and blast through like 2 or 3 times a year because I know I can get to the credits in a couple sittings. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that every Metroidvania needs to be short, but they generally do benefit from a short length, more so than many genres, especially when they're as tightly designed as Dread is. He also mentions that he doesn't like Souls-like elements in his Metroidvania games because he's not interested in making a game too hard. Personally, I certainly don't think every Metroidvania needs Soul-like elements, but it truly is a match made in heaven. I mean, Metroidvanias and Souls-likes, they go together like peanut butter and chocolate. What I think he might not understand, though, is that this isn't just an issue of difficulty. Mechanically, it just means having some sort of currency you get from defeating enemies, a limited but upgradable healing item you can use at will, and checkpoints that heal you and refill your healing stuff, but also make all enemies respawn. That's really what it means to be a Souls-like, the way I see it. It's also funny that he talks about not wanting to make a game too hard, because I would argue that Dread's bosses are more Soulsy than ever, requiring very sharp reflexes and lots of pattern recognition. Honestly, that's what makes them so fun. And if you just have to ask, yes, I would kill for an actual Metroid game with Souls-like elements. Oh boy, wouldn't that be nice. Not that I'm holding my breath for one. So those are my thoughts on this very serious issue. Now, if you'll excuse me, yep, there it is, time to play Dread again. Ah! Ow! Oh, man. Oh, no. Oh, no! Physical amnesia! I don't remember how to drive a car! I forgot how to juggle!